we tend to underestimate the role of the Gulf, because we see it all as South Asia. Or is it about the great powers? That we don't see there as Afghanistan is not just about South Asia. This is actually at the heart of South Asia, Central Asia, and Southwest Asia. These regional actors, I think, will have a pretty big say in how things are going to unfold in the coming days.
As in this week's Raja Mandala, you looked at how the various players in Afghanistan, apart from the Troika plus one, what's being called the Troika plus, which is the US, China, Russia, and now Pakistan, deciding on the future of Afghanistan, and how other players, particularly from the Gulf, are going to play a greater role. So one of the things that struck me was that sort of oddly reminiscent, this Troika plus, or the Troika itself, of, in our school CBSE history, you had in the interwar period, how the lines were drawn in Africa and India. The sort of great powers sitting there with a map, with a ruler, and deciding borders and deciding the fates of nations in which they are. Do you think there's a similar kind of arrogance about Afghanistan even now, despite the many failures of so many, at least two superpowers in that region?
I think that's what is amazing, both because Russia has burnt its fingers. The Americans are leaving. The Chinese have deep concerns about terrorism emanating from Afghanistan. So for them, this idea somehow they can orchestrate the regional thing to produce peace in Afghanistan is kind of a bit presumptuous because this whole Troika plus one was a Russian initiative. But look, it's actually the whole process, both the entire talks in Doha have ended up actually legitimizing the Taliban and undermining the legitimacy of the Kabul government in Kabul. So for them, whatever they might say, the fact is Taliban looks like they're going to do what they want. And the whole pretense of somehow there is a facilitation here is I think, is quite looks quite unreal in terms of where it's likely to go, because Americans they've taken a difficult decision. It's not quite clear, despite a lot of criticism, whether Biden will reverse it. The Russians have really no direct role. In fact, for them to guard their friends in Central Asia is a challenge. And Pakistan, of course, China brings in, of course, a lot more economic resources. So I think they will try their best, but I think there are too many actors who will play their own game. And I thought here we tend to underestimate the role of the Gulf, because we see it all as South Asia. Or is it about the great powers? That we don't see there as Afghanistan is not just about South Asia. This is actually at the heart of South Asia, Central Asia, and Southwest Asia. And it's really the roundabout, as some people call it. It's really at the crossroads of these three different regions. So it has distinct influences from all the three regions. And I think these regional actors, I think, will have a pretty big say in how things are going to unfold in the coming days.
So one of the things you mentioned, it looks like Qatar and Turkey are sort of taking the old political Islam route for want of a better word, supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan. On the other hand, you have Iran, which is resurgent, which, as you pointed out, in the days of the Shah before the revolution. Everyone should read the piece. It has a lot of background. We can't go into all of that here. You will find it, of course, on theindianexpress.com, and wherever you're watching this video, you should probably have the link. So in Iran, so you have Iran on the one hand, Saudi Arabia similarly not that keen on the Taliban anymore as it once was, because they're afraid that as they're moving towards moderation, there will be the kind of influence of having that kind of government in Afghanistan. So how do you see, and in the past you've written about Turkey being increasingly a sort of, on a global stage, if not a strategic, but certainly a diplomatic rival of India's in the way things are going. How do you see India and Iran then coming closer together, and how should New Delhi conceivably play that relationship up for how things are going to unfold in Afghanistan?
Because if you see, Afghanistan as a crossroads, I think they always had a Turkic influence, because the northern areas of Afghanistan, which are linked to Central Asia, most of them are Turkic-speaking people, except the Tajiks, who are more Persian-speaking. So there is a deep Turkic influence in the north. And then Iran, I think parts of Afghanistan were always part of the Iranian empires. Iran had great empires, so they were always part of it. But for Iran today, I mean, there are multiple issues. It's a neighbor. It's actually, of all the countries that you mentioned, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, only Iran has borders. In fact, Afghanistan has borders really with, on the east it is Pakistan, on the west is Iran, and in the north you have the Central Asian Republic. So Iran, by nature of its location, has always been an important factor. And historically, Iran had great ambitions of being a regional power, and those ambitions have not died. And the reason, the challenge for Iran today is that a Taliban that is brings in a Sunni extremist kind of ideology. And Taliban's record in the past, in fact, when Taliban was ruling Afghanistan between 1996 to 2001, there were frequent clashes between Iran and Taliban ruled Afghanistan, because you have the oppression of the Shia Hazaras in the north, and the potential support of Taliban to Sunni militants who are coming across from Iran into this side. So there are, I think, naturally it's between neighbors, there are always going to be frictions. And given the deep ideological character of the Taliban and its oppression of religious minorities, I mean, sectarian minorities, we're not even talking about the Sikhs or the Hindus in Afghanistan, we're talking about Shia Muslims, and we're talking about even the Sunnis who are from the north. So there is this, that I think clearly creates problems for Iran. But Iran also has been engaging Taliban. It's not as if they can't afford not to engage the Taliban either, because for them, because there is a shared interest against the United States. So Taliban, there were contacts between Iran and Taliban. There have been contacts. So I think Iran has to look at all sides. And as I mentioned, it's refused to join the Troika talks this week. So I think Iran will play its own game. And it's quite surprising. You saw Minister Jaishankar's visit to Tehran and very effusive comments by the new president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, saying, look, we must work together on regional security. We need to do more things. So that's interesting. And for India too, Iran with Russia really turning to the other side, I think Iran becomes an important partner. So I think that doesn't mean they agree on everything. Yeah. But in the Middle East, you have to have a lot of stomach, because everyone is playing many sides. So you have to have the stomach to deal with lack of clear kind of things that Indians are used to. But my sense is this seemingly we're going to do more things with Iran. And I think you'll have to work with everyone. It's not that people are just going to line up with you and say, look, we are with you all the way. Nobody goes all the way. But I think we need to, and similarly in the longer term, we also need to engage Saudi Arabia and UAE, because both they have stakes, both religious or otherwise, and they have resources, economic resources. So my sense is we need to factor in the Gulf in our own regional security calculus.
So one thing you'd mentioned in the piece in passing, or not so much in passing, but in the thing you mentioned in the piece, is that right now, given that the Taliban seems to not have changed all that much with its recent behavior, and the domestic pressure in the US across the aisle, that danger, do you think that is something that Biden may or may not reverse his decision, like you said? We'll have to wait and see. But that is something, say, even for countries like India, who are among all the players engaged here, some of the few true democracies which also have their own local politics, which in India, if you're say, it can play up in certain ways. It's not predictable. How do you think that is going to be a factor increasingly, that the fact that the Taliban at the end of the day is the Taliban? I mean, like you said, deeply ideological, deeply sectarian, violent, and not in that sense to modern nation states a bit of an anathema.
No, I think, the history of the region, I mean, I think one of the great tragedies, I think Afghanistan was a fairly moderate country, as long as it was a monarchy and a fairly relaxed place. And I think what 1979, three big things happened in the region. I think one was the attack on the Grand Mosque in Mecca, where the Islamic militants were trying to storm the mosque and were trying to, attack the regime, the Saudi House of Saud. Then we had the Iranian Revolution, Islamic Revolution in Iran. And then we had the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. So three great events that kind of produced a situation in the subcontinent that profoundly altered life in the subcontinent. As someone who lived through that era, I think I can tell you the life in India before 1979, or South Asia as a whole, and after, were two dramatically different things. You could see, we could walk into students of JNU, we could walk into Prime Minister's house, no security, no question of anybody checking you. To what happened since the 80s, the violence, the terrorism, much of that, because partly, as I mentioned in the piece, the strategy that the US and Pakistan used against the Soviet occupation was to mobilize religious jihad. It was the godless communists who took over Kabul. So you throw in the Islamic militants against the regime. There used to be standard congressmen used to come to Peshawar, stand next to this long-bearded gentleman and say, these are freedom fighters. And America poured in resources. And then for Saudi Arabia, they were so afraid of Islamic zealots in their own country, they diverted a lot of them to Afghanistan. Okay, you want to be radical, go and fight in Afghanistan and leave us alone. So you had the whole mobilization of the Arabs, the Arab Afghans. And bin Laden was one of them. And then you have Iran, had its own problems because it was preoccupied with the Iran-Iraq war. They didn't play much role in the 80s. So you had actually, for the first time, instrumentalization of religion. And under Zia-ul-Haq, Pakistan dramatically changed from being a fairly liberal place, which was Islamic, which had serious issues of border with India, of territory with India. But it was not a religious state, which is what Zia-ul-Haq transformed Pakistan into, much to the dismay of the liberal elites in that country, and transformed that nation. So you had actually the Afghan jihad, Islamization of Pakistan, and the Gulf. They had more money because of the oil, promoting different groups in South Asia. So you had a deadly cocktail that came in. And of course, that produces consequences of its own. And much of what you saw happen in South Asia after that cannot be traced to these three great events in 1979. And my sense is, if Taliban becomes aggressive, takes positions, it's going to impact everyone. If it is for Saudis, for the Iranians, and for Pakistan above all. India still has a Pakistani buffer, if you will. But Pakistan itself, if you see last few days, Taliban has shut down the borders, saying that, look, you must have a free entry into Pakistan. You have the Pakistani Taliban said, look, they want autonomous zone an independent zone in the tribal areas. So see, the problem is you play with religion and think that you can use it as a card against the others. There is a big danger. In fact, Pakistan will be the most vulnerable to that backlash that might come, and the war in Afghanistan spilling over into the Pakistani territory, producing all kinds of, like you've seen the sectarian thing in Pakistan, in the constant attack on Ahmadiyas or on Shias. So I think you have actually that kind of a poison once you introduce, and it's going to spread in the rest of the region. So we might be in for some serious trouble if Taliban comes back with the kind of international endorsement that it is seem to be getting at this point.
The final question, just taking off from this one slightly, is that the two phrases you said most often that are used about Afghanistan, great game from the colonial era, and of course the graveyard of empires, which is the thing. What you say, so it seems like in the I think China, even Russia, Pakistan, maybe even the US. I think to play the great game, they forget that it's the graveyard of empires sometimes.
Yeah, but I think, the problem with this kind of, these are attractive phrases, all of us use it and convenient, but the reality is far more messier, because in the end, the British India, and firstly, it was not Great Britain, it was really Indian resources.
Yeah.
And even today, if you go to the India Gate, you see the names out there on the wall. A lot of them are who fought in the Afghan wars. So Britain had a disastrous first Afghan war, but eventually they stabilized Afghanistan.
Yeah.
They constructed a relationship. So it was never, this idea it's just a graveyard of empires is a facile kind of a proposition. Same thing with Great Game. I think it's not just between big powers. As we said, look, what Saudi Arabia did in the 70s, in the 80s. Yeah. Pakistan's role is critical. Look, for all the American money, $2 trillion, 20 years, 150,000 troops, that couldn't prevent Pakistan from playing a spoilers game in Afghanistan, which it did successfully. So this idea, it is the big boys do it and the small guys are really victims of this. In fact, if you see the original great game, it was India that played the role, undivided India. And in the second round with Russia and it was Pakistan and the others who played the game. And today, if China comes in, there will be a whole new coalitions will be built. But I'm sure at this point, China is also quite careful. So I think we are in for a messier. And the other thing is, of course, compared to the great powers, I mean, today regional powers are strong. Iran has a lot more resources, has a lot more capabilities. So does Saudi Arabia, so does India, so does Pakistan. So you're going to see a lot more jockeying than in the previous era. So it's to focus on the regional game might be more interesting at this point of time.
Great, sir. Thanks so much.
Thanks.